Well, welcome everyone. It is good to have you here. Well, I know we got folks finding their way in now. It's a beautiful spring day here in Boston. Our semester is coming to an end, and we are going to be beginning this webinar. So, as a way of introduction, my name is Daniel Jocelyn Simatowski. I'm the Craft Failing Professor and Director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. And I'm pleased to welcome you to our webinar today with Dr. John Michalczyk. Dr. Michalczyk is Professor and Director of Film Studies, also here at Boston College. Uh, he has written and directed numerous books and documentary films dealing with historical events such as World War II and the Holocaust, as well as themes about conflict resolution, moral issues, and social justice. Among his many books, I want to especially note Filming the End of the Holocaust, Allied Documentaries, Nuremberg, and the Liberation of Concentration Camps from 2014. And among his also many of documentaries he's composed, two are of note for the work of our center. One of Stars and Shamrocks, Boston's Jews and Irish, and The Cross and the Stars, Jews, Christians, and the Holocaust. John has been serving here at Boston College for 50 years. He has been a real mentor and teacher across generations here. He has shared with me that among one of the things he's most proud of is the over 100 students who've created their own documentary films on issues of social justice. And John has also been a longtime friend and supporter of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning since its very beginning. So I'm really just pleased to have John be with us to discuss his newest book titled Antisemite Julius Streicher, and he will be speaking on this topic today. After his presentation, there'll be a period of question answer. We will have the chat function open, so please submit your questions into the chat, and I will pose those to him as I'm able. So please, John, we welcome you here.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll share my screen. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to share my ideas on what I've studied for 40 years now in terms of the Holocaust, Jews and Christians during this era, but also the center sponsored our speakers in the past, and they were on various different topics, but the latest was Sharon Reveau from the National Center for Jewish Film, who talked about life prior to the Holocaust, Jewish life, especially in Vienna. And so did Hani Meyer, former professor at Boston College. So I am delighted that the center has been able to sponsor a lot of our work. So this focus will be on how Julius Streicher during the Third Reich and even before had this one obsession of the hatred of Jews. And his was basically a campaign throughout the, I would say, almost 25 years of his research on the Jews and the hatred that he had of them, which resulted in the propaganda efforts he made in Der Stürmer Tabloid. It was a sort of a smear sheet. And then his publishing of 3 books that dealt with Jewish themes, anti-Jewish themes for children. So his idea was to brainwash not only the German public, but also children from probably the age of 9 or 10 right till 18, when they would go into the military and be further brainwashed. So I'm going to show you how he is a Christian, a born Catholic, relying upon Hitler's writings, and show how they infiltrated the educational system of Germany from the 20s, but especially after 1933, when Hitler became chancellor, and then the following year, the Fuhrer the leader of Germany. So notice the language that Streicher is using in 1933 to praise Hitler. Okay, and he says, my racial comrade. So you hear the church bells ringing for the new Germany. This is the church dedicated to Mary, the Frauenkirche, in Adolf Hitler Square. So, he praises God. Let us thank God that has come. This day has come when Hitler becomes chancellor. And then all of Nuremberg celebrates Adolf Hitler. So the whole idea is throughout his work, he often uses Christian language and images to denigrate the Jews and dehumanize them. So here Hitler and Streicher, bald-heading, tough bully, they're both pictured in the early 1920s. They became friends because they were on the Western Front in World War I, the Great War. Both received an Iron Cross. Their background was very similar in this respect. They were born and baptized Catholics, and Hitler was even confirmed, but his father was not interested in religion, but his mother was. That was a little different from Julius Streicher. He was born Catholic near Augsburg. A father was a teacher, but extremely religious. So Streicher at first became very much interested in teaching, and he was finally rejected from that later on, as we're going to see. So early on in the 20s, even before they took over the beer hall putsch in November of 1923, they were friends. And this is really a tale of two cities, Munich and Nuremberg. A lot of the party met at first in the early 20s in Munich, but then the great rallies that you might see in, for example, the very, very professional film, but racist, Triumph of the Will by Leni Riefenstahl. Streicher helped organize all these rallies in Nuremberg. So this is one of the images that you have of Streicher and Hitler. You could see Streicher on Hitler's left or right, on a great day of gathering in 1927. When both of them were involved in the attempt to take over the government in Berlin in 1923, they organized a march, and it was part of a putsch in Munich, and they were going to march onto Berlin, just as Mussolini had marched on Rome. So that's what their attempt was, but they never got too far because they were stopped by the police, and they were both sentenced to jail. And here on the right, you see Hitler in his Landsberg prison. And he was sentenced to 5 years for his activity in the putsch, but he only served 9 months. But these were a critical 9 months, primarily because he considered this his university. He had the chance to type on his Remington typewriter there every day the basics for Mein Kampf that would be published exactly 100 years from this year. And it was his attempt to deliver this semi-autographical, I would say pseudo-biographical text, diary, but also a political manifesto, how he would make Germany a greater Germany, even with the basic ideas of Lebensraum, taking over Austria on the page 3 of Mein Kampf. But you're going to see that Streicher used Mein Kampf as his Bible in his writings in both the tabloid and the children's readers that he had published. So in 1923, late April, just about this time, he published his first issue of the Stürmer, the Stormer or the Attacker. And it was basically to attack his enemies. Basically, I would say the Marxists at that time, and then specifically the Jews. So his description, usually Hitler's description and Streicher's descriptions were very much the same. Jews were liars, vermin, cheaters, conspirators, wanted to take over the world. So this is the simplistic tabloid that he published, 4 pages, maybe, just about 5, and then it became 16 pages, and 10,000, 15,000 of these issues would be, published and usually shown in a sort of display case in bus stations, in political areas, and so on, so everybody could read them. And his approach would be definitely anti-Jewish. So you see him in this pose. This is what, you often see Mussolini, especially standing in the balcony, Il Duce. And this is what, Streicher sort of imitated. And I said, he basically ruled with an iron fist. William Schreier, who was one of the first to, write a good history of the rise and fall of the Third Reich, said he always carried a whip, and he would, beat people to keep them under control when he became Gauleiter or Nazi leader in Nuremberg. But right through the publications of Der Stürmer from 1923 to 1945, right before the end of the war, he used his artist, Philipp Ruprecht, who was named Phipps, and he created an image of, here, vermin. You could see the traditional kind of image that he would use. A big nose, extended, bulging eyes, and here, it's a horrible looking creature controlling the world. And that came out of his idea of the protocols of the elders of Zion and Hitler's reading of many different texts. But this would be a good example of how he would use satanic figures, some of them coming right out of the Hebrew Testament or the Christian Testament. And in this particular case, you can see this devilish satanic image of a Jew with Star of David, drooling, large nose, elfish ears, and so on. And you see money, a percentage sign behind, controlling the world, and you see a dollar bill on his left arm, a dollar sign. And under each one, each page 1, you have the Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. And that would be the motto of Streicher and also of, Hitler, but it came from the 1890s Berlin Conference. So this is the first image of using Christian ideas. And this one comes right out of John's Gospel, 8:44, when Jesus calls, some of the Jewish leaders who were very opposing to him. Because you are unable to hear what I say, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. So as you can look at the devilish image in the center of one of the books, children's readers, you'll see a horrible looking devil, beady eyes, large nose, scales, a tail, and horns. And right around, just very much like one of the altar pieces, you have different stories going around the central image. And it's basically how Jews enter into other civilizations and corrupt them and take over. So the bottom especially is very interesting in Africa. And then in the middle panel, Egypt, if you can recall the Exodus, where the Jews were, basically incarcerated in Egypt, doing what I was jokingly referring to, the Works Progress Administration, that Roosevelt had initiated. But this is an example how he would use biblical writings, especially this one text, a handbook for the question of the Jewish question, some of the Talmud, and the Gospels. This is one example that he would use throughout, a satanic seducer of Gentile women. So on the right, you have this, satanic figure with horns, and he has a Star of David, however, with a hammer and sickle, to indicate what became very, very common later on in the late 30s and 40s, the Bolshevik Jew. And here he's seducing a young woman, and you're going to see this image a little later on too. She's wearing a cross, carrying a missile, and one of the times Streicher and Ruprecht would use pornographic images. Everybody, even the Nazis, hierarchy, would see him as a lowlife and pornographer. And look at the image of Eve on the right hand top. You'll see, his idea of a curvaceous Eve, always naked or, poorly clad. And this is the second image that he uses. And here, the same type of satanic devilish character, here posing as a monk, large nose, beady eyes, Star of David on his head with horns and weird looking ears. He's trying to tempt this nun coming in the convent itself. She has a cross, and he's carrying a bag of devisen, currency or money. When he does his children's books, you'll see that he likes to use, a couple of different illustrators. This one is the first, done by a young woman. She's about 21 years old, kindergarten teacher, taking art. And it's this notion that you can't trust a fox on his green heath and a Jew on his oath. This quote was traced to Martin Luther. And here you see in the mural on the right, Martin Luther as an old figure, and on the left, a hunter carrying a fox. You have the same quote that is used as the title of this book. Look at the image of the cover. You have the sly looking wolf or fox on the left, and a sinister looking Jew, again with the extended nose, and then a Star of David on the top right. So this quote seemed to come from Martin Luther when he wrote this anti-Semitic text on the Jews and their lies. He was an Augustinian friar, but became more and more anti-Semitic and very nationalistic. He felt that the Jews were not really German. And that was the same thing Hitler and Streicher believed, that the Jews were outliers, never German citizens, even though they were. But what was even worse was that Martin Luther called Jews and their synagogues horrible people, a den of thieves, and they should be burned down. And that's what actually occurred in Kristallnacht in November of 38, the night of broken glass. So these are the other two. So you saw the one about the fox. The second one is the poisonous mushroom in 1938, 2 years later. You see this horrible image of a stereotype of a Jew sad-looking, drooping eyes, large extended nose, and surrounded by four other similar Jews. And the whole idea of this book was to talk about the morality of Jews, which is depicted as very, very horrible. Ernest Hemer wrote the text, Streicher published the book, and it was intended to show that children should understand the difference between a Gentile and a Jew, but in horrible language. And a lot of this is, similar to the Grimm's brothers, where they would have a moral tale, or an interesting tale for the youth. What Goebbels, propagandist number one, and Streicher number two, would only talk about this as education and enlightenment. The third book on top is called The Mongrel, and it's a hybrid looking dog that's, a poodle, a pincer, and so on. So they're all molded into this one curious looking dog who was called a mongrel. And that's exactly what Streicher used to call Jews, both hybrid and mongrels. Here are a couple of myths, Christian myths about the Jews, starting early on in the Middle Ages, but some of them even developed during the first centuries of the Christian era. And this one is the myth of blood libel, or it's often called ritual murder. And on the right is the original image of how this ritual murder would take place. You have a Christian boy who is kidnapped, and the Jews surrounding him were drawing his blood. It would drip into this, tray or a plate, and underneath you had other Christian boys who were already killed. So what Streicher does in one of his special issues, he did 2 or 3 like this, it would be called Ritual Mort, and it's the same exact pose. You see the young boy standing above a font, and around him were the Jews who were drawing his blood. The bodies of them, of the other children who were drawn, whose blood was drawn, are right below. And they believed at that time that the Jews were using the Christian blood for matzah or for ritual services. A lot of this especially was, reinforced by this drawing in the 15th century, but it was based, some of this was based on William of Norwich, because in 1144, he was missing, so they declared him a victim of the Jews. And this is how a lot of the myth was reinforced. And the tabloid would continue this image long after the 14th century and 15th century. Further use of Christian imagery comes in the tabloid. Here you have Jesus chastising, on the right, a Protestant pastor, and on the left, a Catholic priest. In the background is the usual cross that he used and abused throughout the children's books, as well as the newspaper, the tabloid. And underneath is the caption, 2,000 years ago, Jesus says, I called the Jews a chosen people, but you have made out of them a cursed people, but you have made out of them the elect nations, the chosen people. The Nazis also, right from 1920, felt that the Christians had to combat the Jewish materialistic spirit. And they also saw already this idea that the Jews were outliers and a different race. Another myth is that of the wandering Jew. And supposedly it originated in the 13th century when this Jewish man would see, a tradesman, would see Jesus on the way to Golgotha, and he cursed Jesus and refused to help him with the cross, the burden of the cross. So the father, Jesus, and the father supposedly cursed him that he and the following generations would wander the earth. And so that was the theme of the wandering Jew or the eternal Jew, something that Joseph Goebbels wanted to promote, especially in this documentary, pseudo-documentary, called The Eternal Jew. Very, very successful Jewish propaganda film that Goebbels especially wanted to show the army to rationalize why they're killing the Jews, with the Einsatzgruppen. And on the bottom right, you see an image of that made famous, Gustav Doré's The Wandering Jew. So you have the comparison of carrying the staff, Jewish, ugly looking man with his face distorted, carrying his burden. Now, the image of the cross again. The wayside cross, the wayside image of a crucifixion was very common in especially rural areas like Bavaria and in other countries as well in Eastern Europe. So the Stürmer publishes this image to reinforce the notion that Jews were guilty of deicide, killing Jesus. And in the image, a stormtrooper, an SA, holding his spouse, says basically that this is what the Jews did to Jesus. They put him on the cross and he died. In the background, with rays coming out of it, is the swastika. So in many images in the Stürmer and elsewhere, you have the pastoral cross, usually of Bavaria, in the background. The further image of the wayside shrine is here depicted in one of the children's books, a rural woman with her 3 children look up at the cross, and the German says what Christ said about the Jews. And this image from the poisonous mushroom basically spreads the idea that the Jews were guilty of the killing of Jesus. And, it's a child seeing this would be reinforced that, we are the children. We're very similar to these kids. And we're looking at this lesson that the Jews killed Jesus. A further image of the wayside cross is depicted here in the Stürmer with a very hypocritical idea of the Nazi stormtroopers giving the Hitler salute to the cross, and the stormtroopers' banners all furling in the wind with church in the background as usual. But the whole idea is that the Jewish man, stereotyped here in this story called The Resurrection, is fleeing because of the power of the stormtroopers. You see how he's stereotyped and very commonly throughout the Stürmer. Bowler hat, large nose, usually robust, and so on. Another image of using the crucifix is a political one. After the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the Jews were called warmongers. They were forced to eliminate their Air Corps, their Army, and their Navy, and their land, right around Alsace-Lorraine, for example. The Rhineland would be occupied by France. So they had to pay high reparations that could not be paid off actually until 2010 from reparations from the First World War ending in 1918. So Owen Young, a diplomat, proposes to negotiate the payments. So you can see that he's crucified on a cross instead of INRI, the Latin Jesus Nazareum Rex Judaeum. You have Young, and the waistband says Deutschland, Germany, and the Jewish man, same kind as you've seen before, large nose, balding head, kind of heavyweight, overweight, laughing, while the politicians scuffle over this idea of should we pay, should we not pay, and so on. So the title is The Jews Laugh. The Jew laughs while they, the political parties, scuffle. Another image of the cross, when the Germans invaded Poland, September 1st, 1939, England and France declared war on Germany as well. So the image is the stereotypical Marianne, and she's usually described as having a red bonnet. So here she is hanging on the cross, but the cross is the British flag, and it's France on the cross. Another myth of Christians about the Jews is that, comes right out of Hitler's Mein Kampf, that the Jews are the plague. And here, the top image comes out of the third children's reader, The Mongrel, and it's the Grim Reaper hovering over a city very much like Nuremberg, with all the crosses marking the dead. So the bubonic plague, the Jews struck the city. In the bottom image, because the Jews supposedly poisoned the wells of the Gentiles, many people are dying. So the Jews would be put into a mass bonfire and burned. And this is from the Nuremberg Chronicle of 1493. So it's this idea of the myth of Jews being the bubonic plague. This is one of the more grotesque kinds of images that the artist and Streicher would publish. Otto Meyer was called the crucifixion Jew, and you see his not his name, but the crucifixion Jew on the cross itself. He's pictured in a very grotesque figure, large nose, big eyes, elfish ears, and this is typical of Phipps. There is a naked woman with a serpent crawling out of her, and the crucifixion Jew is holding up a net with these people, including the girl, and men on his left arm. And this is marked make way. So, but look at the horror depicted by this image. You have a second one where it's more of an action kind of film. It's the same kind of stereotypical Jewish man who is the crucifixion Jew, reaching out to grab this woman, a young woman, blonde, of course, and he will torture her with the scourge on the left and then a dagger on the right. Then impale her on the cross tied to a rope. So this is called The Verdict. And you can see that, Otto Meyer, the crucifixion Jew, would be someone who is depicted very negatively in the articles as well as the images. But just to make things clear for the readers, You have the Star of David on his ring, and his hand is very vampirish. You can see the large nails as he reaches out for the woman. The other caricature of the usually a Jew who is now a merchant or a trader, and here he's depicted in this children's book as a tradesman selling fabric, and he tells the young country girl, "This fabric would make you look like a princess." So she looks on, but she's very hesitant. You see her pose, arms crossed, so she's not interested. And in the background, you see that she's, very lower class. Her stockings are hanging up in the kitchen, and there's a cross in the background. So the Jew is going to be very disappointed, and he's the usual typical Jew stereotype, as you saw before. So he's going to move on to the next gullible woman. This is, a little outdated in the Catholic Church. Notice right on the top left is a calendar with the Star of David, and it's Friday, October 21st. So this Itzy is Jewish, just converted to Christianity, and he is eating meat on a Friday. So this is 1936 to 38, and you see how he's illustrated with a very clashing kind of morning gown, and he's eating his goose with a fine wine on a Friday. And the pastor or the local village priest is shocked. So the theme of this image for children is once a Jew, always a Jew. So this would be in the first reader. The kids are very young, and the message is reinforced. You are a newly Christianed person, so you follow the church's regulations. So all of this, of course, was changed in 1966 following the Second Vatican Council. But the idea was, as a Christian, you wouldn't eat flesh on that day. So here's another image of a person who is a newly baptized Christian. He's Jewish, coming out of church with his wife. The wife is talking to the priest, and the newly baptized Jewish man is more interested in ogling the young girls on the left. So the same idea, a Jew is always a Jew. Even though he's baptized, he's still lecherous. Now, of all the images that Phipps and Streicher have published, I find this one I could actually agree with. It's a hypocritical America. This is an issue from the Stürmer. On the background, you see a Native American with feathers in his headdress, a bottle of Feuerwasser, fire water, a weapon marked USA, but with a Bible. So you have a cross, and the bookmark is a Star of David. And the whole idea is that the Jews and the Christians brainwashed the Native Americans into converting, and usually they're taking into Christian schools. So last year, I think it was last October, Joseph Biden, our president, went to Western US, and I think he had references to what was happening in Canada as well, and apologized that Americans over a period of 100 years had taken children into the orphanages and forced them to convert, crop their hair, giving them Christian names, and oblige them to speak in English as opposed to their native language. So this is one of the reasons that is calculated for genocide. It's one of the conditions of genocide, to take children almost, literally from their families, to take them to another destination and convert them. So this is an image that was discussed, or the idea behind it was discussed in a book that talked about how Christians in their institutions really were horribly responsible for, doing this to Native Americans. Now, all of these images, in conclusion, brought Streicher to the Nuremberg trials in 1945-46. This is a setting of the Nuremberg trials underway. It's called the International Military Tribunal, and this is the first one of 12 that brought together the existing war criminals. Some of them had already, committed suicide, like Hitler and Himmler. But you can see in the row right below the military, who are standing guard. The second from the right is the bald-headed Streicher. And above, you see him as a very defiant person. So after 22 years of his publication, of sponsoring all kinds of texts, speeches, and then, of course, the 3 children's readers, he is convicted on 2 counts, but he's indicted on 2 counts, war crimes and crimes against humanity, but the trial sees him only as guilty of count 4, crimes against humanity. So this is something rare happening then and even now, that you could be sentenced to murder for not your actions, but your words and your speeches. Now think in terms of the relevance to today. Someone who writes an op-ed page, supporting Hamas, as you saw recently, or something critical, that they would be deported or sent to, some kind of institution far away. This led him, Streicher, to the gallows. And here on the right-hand side, you see he is hanged, and the rope is still hanging in his neck, and he is placed into a coffin. And then he is cremated right outside of Munich, and his ashes were sent into a stream so that there wouldn't be a type of pilgrimage site for him. The same thing that they did to Osama bin Laden. I made that mistake before. But, it's very curious that as he's being hanged, he's still very defiant. And he says 3 or 4 things. Now it goes to God. Heil Hitler. This is curious. Purim Fest 1946. And here at the above image, you have 3 Jewish soldiers celebrating Purim. And then his final words, he would say, the Soviets will hang you one day, saying that to the Germans who were in the audience. And that's how his life ended. He was a rabid anti-Semite. He used all different kinds of images from the Talmud and from the Gospels to dehumanize Jews. And that brought him to the gallows for aiding and abetting what would come in the Shoah. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for that. really fascinating and times horrifying walk through Julius Streicher and his work. We'll start with a question that was posed, and I invite others to pose questions in the chat as well. Uh, it seems that with the anti-Jewish imagery that was seen that this RS Phipps does to support Streicher's work, to what extent do Hitler and Streicher regard Christianity as a continuation, Judaism, and is that part of why they turned against it as well? Or another way to expand on that is it seems in some of the early uh, examples you gave us, there's this anxiety that Christians might be too friendly towards Jews, especially this critique of the Christian churches not paying attention to Christ's condemnation of the Jewish people in Streicher's words. So can you just speak to that aspect of the work?
Yeah, well, his idea, Stryker's idea, was that the Gospels, especially Matthew and John, were showing that Jesus, never talking about his Jewish background, condemned Jews. They would raise the issue of the issue at the temple, turning over the tables, calling them, Jewish collectors and, interested only in money and not in the reverence. So he felt that Jesus was very much opposed to all Jews. And of course, if you study some of the theological, research, especially over the past 50 years, you'll see that, the Gospels were more, those two Gospels especially had a lot of polemics going on between the Romans, the new Christians, and the older Jewish community. So that was not known in 1936-38. So basically, he saw Jewish uh, people as a race and not really what you're saying, like a continuation of the Bible. He saw them as something different. He first saw it as religious anti-Semitism in Vienna in 1905 when he lived there, when he was applying for art school. But then he considered them a race that was very distinct from the Gentile race, the Aryan race. Also later on, uh, he under uh, Bishop Ludwig Müller, a friend of Hitler's during World War I. He was the chaplain in World War I. He wanted to merge the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church into one national church. So it would become the national church versus the Jews. And, that's what I think that, became more important for Hitler because the Catholic Church, especially, was a threat because it was universal and there were a lot of Catholics who would be voting for him. And as a result, he treaded lightly with doing things against the Catholic Church, but he did eventually, especially we saw in Holland.
Good. That's really helpful. Just a question that's coming in from the chat from a few folks was about your forthcoming book. When's your book being released? I don't think we have a pre-sale on that yet, do we?
Right. I just heard today that they're moving it from late summer to the early fall because, they wanted to, do it especially during the opening of the academic year and distribute it. And it's also going to be on open access. So it's going to be a little more available. Uh,
Right.
and they're working hard with the images because I was contracted for 75 images, and I said I can't possibly tell this story with 75 images. So how would 205 do?
Right.
And they were a little shocked at that. So we negotiated with 180.
Okay. Well, we'll make sure that we get some information about that book when we release in about a week the edited version of this video, which participants can view and share, and we'll make sure we have a link in there to the publisher's site as well. So thank you, John. To go into some more questions, a question regarding gender is it seems in the propaganda there's a lot of presentation of that demonizes Jewish men. Jewish women are very rarely depicted. Jewish Christian women are often shown as a symbol, especially a symbol of this kind of unwanted advances by Jewish men. Um, was there a reason that Jewish women are shown less? And can you maybe speak to some of the gender dynamics going on in this imagery?
In the children's readers, especially, you only see women, Jewish women, as being attached to a Jewish male. For example, you see one called the Sabbath, and it's Itzig who is going off to the Sabbath uh, after, manipulating and cheating Gentiles all week. So he piously goes to the temple, and the temple looks very much like the synagogue of Nuremberg. And accompanying him is a wife, very robust, stern, all the Jewish characteristics. So Jewish women are always presented negatively. Aryan women, Gentile women are presumed to be either victims of these lecherous Jews, and there are many, there's scores and scores of images of Jewish males dominating Aryan women. And the other group is the simple Gentile woman that comes out of the educational system. And the books on education basically stereotype them. The male boy would be someone who would be trained to be strong and prepared for the military. The women, very sexist, are taught to be breeders, and they wanted to have them choose good spouses and give the Vaterland a lot of males, especially for the military. So this was already in the 1930s and early 40s when, you know, the Hitler war machine was just growing, but it was very stereotypical. Women are weaker and they should only be seen as promoting the fatherland and given bonuses if they could produce more men or more children
Mhm.
as either workers or military. So that was the image. It was very stereotypical all the way through German education. And there was uh, an author, Georg Zima, who wrote Education for Death. And he shows how this is done because he was the headmaster in Germany during this time. And he says it was very chauvinistic. The women are feeble and they should not be trained, they should not be educated, but they should go into um, a type of life that would be very domestic and bring children into the world. And they'd be given an award, a bonus for the more children that they could, spawn, as it were.
Thank you. There's also a question here, and maybe I'll give you a two-parter as a way to, as a last question. One is about how widely disseminated was Streicher's works, especially among children. These children books, I think, are especially shocking. So, can you tell us anything about the evidence for their distribution, their use, their popularity, and then maybe can you speak about the long history of this kind of imagery and how the legacy of this imagery is still with us today, and ways in which we might respond when we see parallel usages and visual imagery today.
Okay. Maybe you could remind me after I finish the first part.
Okay.
The whole idea was that uh, the the readers especially were mandated, so they would be formally introduced into the classroom, and some of them went 4 editions, 5 editions, up to 40,000, 50,000 copies. So they were widely distributed because the schools were obliged to purchase them for the school students, and they were taught, so that was the whole educational plan for it. So they weren't just a one-time kind of thing from 36 to 40. So you had 36, 38, and 1940 when these readers would be widely distributed. The second part of the question, yes, this does continue. In fact, Andrew Anglin, who is a white supremacist, runs a website called the Daily Stürmer, and it is anti-Semitic, homophobic, and is sort of nationalistic, and it has a wide readership amongst white males. And it continues in the same spirit as Julius Streicher. And there was one other paper in the 70s and maybe early 80s called the Christian Vanguard, and they published, all of these myths from what I had talked about, like ritual murder by the Jews, or the protocols of the elders of Zion. And in the Middle East, the protocols of Zion were, it's supposed to be an alleged forgery of a cabal of Jews meeting to overtake the world. And that was made into, I think, a 20-part or 24-part series on television. So all of this continues on. So if you want to read something, a little more current, you can read about the anti-Semitism in social media. And the publishers, one was from Haifa and the other at Brandeis. And I think it's called the Anti-Semitism in the Social Media. So that would give you an idea how it's infiltrated and continuing on. But look at 2017 in the Charlottesville rally, Unite the Right. The nationalists, the Oath Keepers, all of these who appeared also at the January 6th insurrection were shouting, the Jews will not replace us. And then a typical thing, blood and soil, that is national blood, European, and this is our land and you're not going to replace us. But the whole replacement theory is relating to Blacks and Jews, that this Nordic race coming from Northern Europe is the best, and we fear that the white man is going to be an extinct race, extinct species. So I think that might give you an idea that it's still current.
Yes, yes. This is your talk is coming on the heels of Yom HaShoah last week, and so this is a vivid reminder of the importance of never again and the importance of maintaining historical memory in order to um, address current pressing issues. John, I really want to thank you for being with us. It was a real pleasure to learn from you. Thank you for your scholarship and for your dedication to expanding our understanding and knowledge.